We will start with Dr. Gailey, who I believe is going to come to the podium and get his 3-minute introduction.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Aidan, for arranging this kind of public forum. It's the kind of thing we've certainly wanted for some time, to get some information out to the public on both sides of this issue so that we can make an informed decision. Tonight, we are asking a question that is of the highest civic importance. The question is whether we want to change our Constitution. People will decide whether we have a convention. People will decide who the delegates will be. And people will decide whether we like the results of that convention's work. It's the perfect example of popular sovereignty in New York. And I'm going to suggest to you some reasons why this convention is badly needed. New York is #1 in the corruption index in the country, as determined by the Center for Public Integrity and Politico. A greater number of legislators and state office holders than in any other state, more than 30 in the past decade, have been convicted, sanctioned, or accused of wrongdoing. And to rub more salt in the wound, 6 of those leaders over the last 15 years have had their convictions overturned on appeal. Now ask yourself, what's wrong with that picture? It's a state where bipartisan gerrymandering and financial support that come with office frees state legislators from meaningful competition, making it more likely that legislatures will leave office under criminal prosecution or death rather than being voted out of office. It's a state where we prevent legislators from granting divorces, but not from insulating itself from accountability for their pay raises. It's a state that provides a right to bingo, but not a right to clean air and water. But New York's worst score, 44th, was in providing opportunity for all their citizens. The U.S. News World Report looked at income inequality, poverty rates, median housing prices compared to median incomes, and gaps in education and employment between whites and Asians compared to other minorities, and concluded that for all our progressive rhetoric, we're not doing a very good job at closing the gap, despite spending lots of money. And it's not that New York is more poor than other states. In terms of poverty rates, we're right in the middle of the pack at 24. We're 3rd in the nation in school expenditures, but in the bottom half for achievement. And we have the 2nd highest inequality funding rate between the wealthiest and poorest districts among the states in this nation. But when it comes, we spend lots of money in this state, but when it comes to our roads and bridges and dams and airports and other infrastructure, we get these. It is estimated that New York is facing a $75 billion price tag to take care of our bridges and roads. Is it any wonder that New York continues to hemorrhage population? In 2016, we lost 10 for every 1,000. That's a progression for the last 16 years. It's the biggest migration rate in the nation, and 5th largest if you calculate the figures by rates per 1,000. In the face of these mounting problems, health costs, education, pension, infrastructure, what you're going to hear tonight is a hyped phantom danger of holding a convention and with a straight face say that the legislature is perfectly capable of addressing the problems we face. Thank you.
Try to take my notes. Thank you very much. Let's hear now from Jeremy Toth. And you can come up or you can sit, whichever is best for you.
Doesn't make any difference to me.
Come on up, why not?
Thank you very much. So when Aidan called just, I don't know, a week ago and asked me to represent the no side, I told him, I'm not real comfortable being categorized on one side or the other. Why is that? Because I view this as a very personal decision. Where you're going to vote on whether we have a constitutional convention or not really depends on your own sense of what is possible, your own sense of the good and the bad that could happen, your own faith in New York State politics. I am not a constitutional expert. I've been teaching at UB for 10 years, and I do one class on the New York State Constitution. I certainly don't have as much knowledge about it as Dr. Galley. However, I've been politically active for 20 years, locally, as a Democrat. I'm a partisan Democrat, I should say that right up front. And I am not convinced that this process will lead, for me, to a place that is better than where we are now. I'm just not convinced. In 1997, I voted for it, because in 1997, we had a different political landscape. The political landscape of 2016, 2017, 2018, when all this is going to play out, is much different in my opinion. And again, as a partisan Democrat, there are significant problems facing New York. There are significant problems facing our country. The New York State Constitution, while not perfect, has enough in it that I can sleep at night knowing that it will remain our Constitution. I'm going to vote no. That said, I can understand people voting yes. Again, I'm not here to convince anybody of anything. I'm just here to express my own opinion and how I came to that. And it's my opinion as a left-wing Democrat active in local politics, this is not the right time for this argument.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bobes?
I want to thank everybody for coming tonight to this discussion of one of the most important questions of our generation. Thank you to A.D. Ryan and Counterpoint for putting this event together. Thank you to the Theodore Roosevelt inaugural site and the executive director of the site, Stan Hudson, who I'm proud to say is my cousin, for allowing us to come here and discuss this critical issue. It's fitting as we gather in this site honoring our nation's 26th president and former governor of New York that we draw upon his legacy. I imagine if Theodore Roosevelt were alive today, he would be disgusted by what is happening in his home state. And here are just a few examples. Roosevelt spent his life fighting corruption. New York leads the nation in public officials convicted of federal corruption charges. In 2015, the Assembly Speaker and Senate Majority Leader were both convicted of corruption within a 2-week span of each other. Both convictions were ultimately overturned on appeal. Roosevelt pushed for freedom from the control of money in politics. New York has not enacted campaign finance reform, closed the LLC loophole, or capped outside income for legislators. Roosevelt was a well-known conservationist. New Yorkers enjoy no constitutional right to clean air or clean water. Roosevelt supported primaries instead of nominating conventions. Our state selects its judges with conventions that result in political coronations rather than contested elections. Roosevelt's Progressive Party advocated for popular initiative. New York has never come close to adopting such an initiative, despite a recent poll showing 78% of all New Yorkers, including citizens on both the Democratic and Republican sides, want one. We New Yorkers have a tremendous power, one we do not have at the federal level, to bypass the legislature and to call a constitutional convention. A convention is our only chance to achieve the structural reforms that the state so desperately needs, that its voters so desperately want, and that its legislature will never provide. Let me talk about some of the myths of a constitutional convention. A constitutional convention cannot remove existing pensions. It would be illegal under federal law. Not to mention, there's no incentive among either Democrats or Republicans to take away pensions from hardworking New Yorkers. The notion a convention would reject New York's strong tradition of protecting rights is laughable. Poll after poll shows New Yorkers support protections for the environment, for women, and for organized labor. And for those who say, well, polls can be wrong, New York backs it up at the ballot box. Last November, New Yorkers supported Hillary Clinton by over 22 points. These same voters will be the ones that elect convention delegates. and ultimately we'll have the chance to approve or reject whatever a convention does. A constitutional convention will not turn New York into Mississippi. Some say that convention should yield to the, quote, normal process of legislative amendments. I could not disagree more. Conventions are responsible for almost every right New Yorkers enjoy today. It is the legislative amendment process that has failed us. New Yorkers had the chance to call conventions in 1977 and 1997. They chose not to in both times. In the meantime, the state's problems got worse. The legislature has failed to alter the three-men-in-a-room culture that breeds corruption in the state, adopt term limits, a strong ethics commission, or a truly independent redistricting commission, remedy a complex judiciary that wastes $500 million a year in inefficiencies, stop micromanaging the affairs of municipalities and imposing unfunded mandates on them, bring state and local finance policies out of the 19th century, remedy an educational funding disparity ranked among the worst in the nation, or improve the state's dismal voter turnout. Why would anyone believe the legislature will fix in the next 20 years what they haven't fixed in the last 40? If we vote no this year, we'll be having the same discussion 20 years from now that we're having today. I refuse to stand around paralyzed by a fear that all objective evidence shows is unjustified while we continue to endure mediocrity in our state government. It's a disservice to our forebears like Theodore Roosevelt, who fought for better. It's a disservice to our children and grandchildren who are depending upon us for better. The only thing that stands between us and squandering another generation is a yes vote on November 7th. Thank you.
And Mr. Lipsitz.
Well, good evening. I'm not an expert on constitutional law, Constitution of New York State, not an expert on Theodore Roosevelt, although it's very nice to be here in this house, which we all can agree is a wonderful testament to a pretty important, impressive president. What I am an expert in is labor rights and the rights of working people in this state. And I know that under the current Constitution, those are enshrined as a Constitution. They're not just a statute, they're an actual Constitution. I know that when you open the door to changes on all of those rights, including the one on pension, which, while my colleague on the panel says that the pension couldn't be done away with by law, that's true. But the fact of the matter is that currently the pension is a mandate for municipalities and with a single trustee in the form of the Comptroller of the State of New York. And it's in the Constitution. So the pensioners of New York State are protected. The state pensioners of New York State are protected. I'm a Teamster. My pension was just cut 30%. I don't have the constitutional right to a pension, yet I earned it, and it went away. And that's because of the laws of the federal government, not because of the laws of New York State or the Constitution of New York State. In 1977 and in 1997, 1997, the question of convening a constitutional convention was on the ballot. It was rejected both times. The fact of the matter is that convening a constitutional convention cannot be taken and abstracted from the current political atmosphere in our country and in our state. It is true that we have a state that voted for Hillary Clinton. But in 2 years from now, when a constitutional convention actually would be convened and when people will actually be discussing and debating this, I have no faith that the people elected to that constitutional convention wouldn't be Trump light or right-wingers, and I think, in fact, they'd have an advantage in an election of that variety. And then the question of the labor rights, which I'm most concerned about, prevailing rate, labor, it actually says labor is not a commodity. We have a right to organize and bargain collectively, enshrined in that Constitution, could be taken away by a stroke of a pen, and could then be open to right to work for New York State. Now, it's true that there's amendment process. It also is true that politics are a real thing. If you want to amend something, you have to work very hard at it. You have to amend the Constitution. You have to lobby. You have to come up with rules or laws that you want to see changed. You have to lobby and push for it, and then you have to make sure that it goes through. And if people aren't doing what you like, then you have the opportunity to vote them out of office in New York State every 2 years, the Assembly and the Senate. My view is that we should not open the Constitutional Convention this time. My view is that we're living in dangerous times, and I have utmost respect for the two gentlemen who just spoke. Yes, and I have respect for Jeremy, obviously, he's taking the same side as I am in this debate. But for the two gentlemen who spoke, I have utmost respect for them. They know what they're talking about. They're very smart men. But I represent working class people. And we are concerned about our rights. We are concerned about our guarantees under this Constitution. And we are going to rally our people and push them in the direction of voting no on this Constitutional Convention. And I would recommend that you all think it is.
Thanks to all of you. I just wanted to offer a few quick notes now that I believe everyone who's coming has come. I have these few index cards in my hand. I have more in my jacket and they're more on the table. If you have questions, please grab a card or flag me down. I'll give you one. You can write them down. I'll collect them again. Just make eye contact or give me a little wave, and we'll have those read and answered at the end of this. I'd also like to thank, of course, the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural National Historic Site, and the entire staff. All of them have been so incredibly accommodating, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful to our two sponsors for tonight, the League of Women Voters and the Canisius College Rightly Pre-Law Center. Lastly, the discussion will not end with closing remarks. I know many of us will be adjourning to Coulter Bay after this portion, so there'll be a sort of second informal discussion. Anyone who wants to come is welcome, and it'll all continue there. Thank you.
Okay, we will get underway, and if we can, just so we all kind of have a baseline knowledge of this, I'm going to ask Dr. Galey, if you would, to take just a couple of minutes and walk us through the scenario if the Constitutional Convention passes in 2 weeks and 1 day. That's really just the first step. Can you just explain to everyone briefly what would happen thereafter?
If the voters vote yes on November 7th, the next step would be the selection of delegates. That takes place in 2018. The final selection of those delegates would take place in the general election in 2018. If the delegates process is successful, we expect it would be, the convention will convene in April of 2019. At that time, the convention will organize itself. It will select its leaders and organize its committees, and then proceed about its business. The Secretary of State normally acts as the pro tem organizer until those elections of leadership takes place. They generally meet for about 6 weeks. Almost every convention finish their work in six weeks or so, and the ballot proposition then would be put on the ballot in 2019 November. The convention is required by the Constitution to submit its results to the public 6 weeks before that date, so that the public has full time to analyze and think about what they've presented to us and whether you want to vote for it or not. The vote will take place in November of that year, 2019. If the Constitution and the amendments, the proposals they submit to the voters are approved, or the ones that are approved, they will go into effect legally in January 2020. That's the scheme of the process.
Great, thank you. How are we on microphones? Did everybody hear that okay? Or? There is a mic here in front, so we may need the panelists to use the mic as you respond. Okay, I want to go, if I can, to Mr. Toth and Mr. Lipsitz. If there's anything that Dr. Galey said there that you would like to clarify from your perspective. And then my first question to you would be your response to this side of the table's argument that the New York State Legislature is corrupt and that people have little faith in our elected lawmakers, excuse me, lawmakers, to actually make the changes that a lot of people would like to see.
All right, is that on?
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay. The only thing I would add to what Dr. Galey said about the process is the Constitution actually specifically says that it will continue until it decides it's done. And I was just looking for the language. I don't have the exact language here. So in the past, 67 being the most useful example, it finished, I don't know, sometime in August, I think. But the Constitution itself doesn't proscribe an end date. So aside from that, you know, what Dr. Gailey said laid out the process pretty well. In terms of the corruption, so delegates to the Constitutional Convention are elected. They are elected by Senate district. We have 63 senatorial districts. Every Senate district will get 3, top 3 will go. They will participate, these delegates, in exactly the same political process that our current state legislators participate in. The idea that we are, let me start over. All of these legislators who have been convicted of things, they were all elected. All of them. Every single one of them was elected by us. And we keep sending these corrupt people to Albany. The idea that when given the opportunity to send not corrupt constitutional delegates to Albany, that we're somehow going to wake up as voters and send angels and philosopher kings and objective intellectuals. We're not. It's going to be based on exactly the same political system that we rely on now.
Yeah.
So I just don't see it as a, I see it as a I think the straw man, maybe a straw man argument.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's
Straw
man.
man.
Straw man. I think it's a straw man.
Straw dog.
Straw. Some kind of straw.
Just let me speak to that too. I mean, this is not, we're not in 1776. And I agree with Jeremy. This is not the time where we're going to have some pure light bulb turning on and having us in a situation where only pure people of pure heart become elected to as delegates. I actually think we would be in worse shape to try to keep those guarantees which are in the Constitution now under the conditions of having the same type of corruption spread into the actual Constitutional Convention process itself. So we're very skeptical that this would turn in a way that would enhance rights or expand rights in New York State. I'm also mindful that there could be changes that would be helpful, and I'm also mindful we try not to support corrupt politicians in our process as a labor movement. I'm sure we have, I know we have, but we haven't made it as a policy that we want to continue, nor is it something that we've gone out of our way to try to make sure other people do. We really do try to pick the best people we can for the offices that are existing. Some of them, and we're nonpartisan on that. People think it's always Republicans. It's not. We've given endorsements to Republicans. We give endorsements to people who stand up for the rights of ordinary working people, and that's what we try to do. And I just think that we'd be in a dangerous position and behind, he said straw man, I think it's more like behind an 8 ball if it came to this.
Mr. Boson, Dr. Gailey, why should we have more faith in these delegates than we have in our elected lawmakers?
Speaking about straw man, I didn't hear anyone at this table say that we're going to elect pure as a driven some delegates. So if somebody made that point, I fell asleep on that point. You say something though about corruption. I've studied every constitutional convention from 1777 to the present. Looked at the delegate selection, and what is remarkable is to compare the number of convictions of people who've been in the Senate or the House and the almost non-existent corruption on the part of delegates who served at that convention. That's striking. And part of the reason is a convention is not a legislature. It meets one time, you get 6 months or so, or 8 months, and then you're done. There's no time to work out those close connections and money relationships that occur with long-term legislative leadership. That's a very important point, and I think it needs to be made. So a convention is not a legislative body. It's unicameral. It contains far more than just legislatures. In 1967, there were 13 legislators, sitting legislatures. Out of 186 delegates, that's hardly dominance of legislative insiders. Now, I happen to believe that a sitting legislature and a sitting judge should not be permitted to serve as a delegate. You say to them, look, if you want to be a delegate, you resign your position as judge. If you want to be a delegate, you resign your position as a legislature. But they did not dominate these conventions. And the record of corruption, they're remarkably free of that. I think we need to know the historical facts on this.
Anything to add?
I think, no, I want to emphasize that there are fundamental differences between a legislature and a convention. Some of the other ones are that you have no seniority system in a convention that you do in a legislature. The leadership of a convention is not nearly as strong as it is with the legislature. You don't have the 3 men in a room. You don't have delegates that basically, if they don't follow directly in line with their leadership, wind up getting the office in the basement there and never are heard from for decades after that. Also, you don't have, they're fundamentally focused on revising the Constitution. They're not dealing with a budget. They're not dealing with the day-to-day governance of the state. So you have people who are approaching this with a lot more focus on that issue. And that's why historically, not just in 1777, but in 1938, even the 1967 convention, which work was ultimately voted down by the voters, produced a very forward-looking progressive constitution. So this process has produced a good work product in the past, and the reason we believe that is because it is not a legislature. There are fundamental differences between the two bodies that one sets one up for more success in the area of constitutional revision than the other.
Mr. Lipsitz, let me ask you about, at least I as a reporter, besides maybe complaining about high taxes in this state, the one thing that you seem to hear from people the most is we need ethics reform, we need to clean up Albany. How would you suggest that we accomplish ethics reform in the absence of a constitutional convention? Because it has failed kind of time and time again.
Well, I mean, I'm of a number of minds on this question. Let's just, oh, I'm sorry. This question of whether we're the most taxed state in the union, and if there's a relationship between being the most taxed state in the union and corruption. I don't know if you were making that, but I don't see.
No, I was saying that was the complaint I hear the most is I pay too much in taxes. Second is corruption.
Corruption exists in all kinds of institutions. It exists in labor unions, although I don't think it's a dominant trend by any means, and it hasn't been. It's been in eclipse for a long, long time. It exists in private businesses, in publicly traded businesses, and it exists in our legislature. There's no question about it. I don't know that it's any worse than any other state of the country, and I do know, and I also think that the way to solve this problem is the good old-fashioned way. Find candidates who represent the interests of ordinary people and allow them and push for them to be elected into the positions of authority, either in the Assembly or the Senate or the governor, for that matter, and the other state officers. And I just don't think there's any magic bullet on this question. That takes a lot of hard work. It takes a lot of hard work from ordinary people, from people who care deeply about this. I'm quite sure that we would be on the same side of a series of candidates who if we had a chance to actually vet them and see that they are against wasteful government spending, against corruption and bribery and all kinds of the shenanigans that go on. I don't see a constitutional convention as being a magic elixir for that any more than I do anything else. What I see as the cure for that is, as I said before, ordinary democracy, people's democracy, people getting involved in the political process, finding candidates, pushing positions, and then electing them to office. That's what I think is the only, there's no shortcut. It's the only way.
For the voters.
That's correct, but I think there's an old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And if criminal statutes and jail time and doing 13 years in prison for Shelley Silver wasn't enough to keep him from doing corrupt activities, if you really think the threat of, oh my goodness, I might lose my pension as a legislature with all the money he made over the years from his law firm in New York City, if you think that's going to be the deterrent that's going to get him to say, whoa, wait a minute, maybe I shouldn't do this, I don't believe it is. I think you're not addressing the underlying concern. You're not addressing the 3 men in a room. You're not imposing term limits that are going to prevent these leaders from accreting the kind of power that these gentlemen had. Preet Bharara, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Manhattan, who prosecuted both Dean Skelos and Sheldon Silver, talked about the corruption and the amount of power that these leaders were able to accumulate. You've done nothing to fix that. You haven't done term limits. You haven't done any sort of independent redistricting commission that's going to allow candidates to come in and challenge these people. Once you get in the legislature, you know, the notion of that you're just going to go and take on the established politician and win, good luck. The way the seats are drawn, that just doesn't happen in New York State. and you don't have any sort of strong ethics reform, and I have no reason to believe that the legislature is going to do any of those three things, which I think any of them would do more to prevent corruption than just taking a pension from somebody that's already going to prison anyway. And by the way, in light of the recent overturning to the convictions, because both Sheldon Silver and Dean Skelos' convictions were overturned, they wouldn't lose their pensions under the amendment anyway.
Dr. Galey, let me ask you to address the concern that Mr. Lipsitz has brought up repeatedly and what we see from those who are opposed to this, which is the worry that especially workers' rights could be reduced, eliminated in a constitutional convention.
Here's what I would say about that. We have two grounds for giving us some sense of how to answer that question. That is it a real concern? Is it not a real concern? If you want to say it's a real concern, then you have to have something on which to base that. What would you base it on? Well, one would be the constitutional record and history of the state. What did they do in the past? The other would be, what are the sentiment and values of New Yorkers in terms of these issues? In terms of the constitutional conventions, the record of those conventions, not the legislature, by the way, has been to add rights. Everyone has added rights. It's a great tradition in New York. So the record of the past conventions would not support it. But more importantly, over the past 50 years, every poll we've taken in this state indicates that there's strong support, I mean very strong support, for the care for the needy. 96% of New Yorkers said no one in this state should go hungry. And overwhelming numbers of them, time after time, support the forever wild and the right to conservation. And time after time, even when there was controversy about the labor unions and the pensions, still a plurality not only supported those pensions, but did not want them taken away, and even supported rights that labor doesn't have, like the right to strike. So where is this danger going to come from? And I'm not talking about a flash poll taken 2 years ago. I'm talking about polling of New Yorkers over the past 50 years. We have a state that is characterized in our political culture by a kind of what I would call a benevolence towards people, a tolerance of individual diversity, and a kind of individualism. And that spirit is what makes us New Yorkers. It's not something that some public opinion firm can overnight turn around. That's why I think the danger is from it.
So if I could just respond.
Jumping out of your seat.
Yeah, so everything Dr. Galey said is true of New York. I think that's fair analysis of New York. However, despite all that, we have a New York State Senate that is controlled by Republicans. We have a New York State Senate that is controlled by some very conservative Republicans. And I'm not saying that pejoratively, it's just true. So the idea that the political process of New York and the people of New York will just naturally protect the rights that we've come to cherish, I just don't think, it flies in the face of political reality. Remember, I focus on the Senate because that's how we're going to elect our delegates. So the map that we are currently dealing with, that has been reapportioned by Republicans to ensure that they stay in power, just like the Assembly Democrats draw their map to stay in power, but we're only talking about the Senate, the very same map that produces a Senate that is controlled by Republicans is going to produce our delegates. So the idea that, well, New York's liberal and New York's progressive and we voted for Hillary and so we don't have to worry about, any of those progressive issues that some people are worried about, not everybody, but some people are worried about. I think it flies in the face of political reality.
I need to respond to that.
Yeah. Can I ask one question just as you do it? There are also 15 at-large delegates, right?
This is quite a skew. First of all, Republicans control the Senate only by virtue of 5 independent Democrats. Secondly, there are 15 at-large delegates. When's the last time New York State elected a statewide Republican? We all are pretty sure, whether you're right or left, that the political scientists have analyzed this, pretty sure that 13 of those 15 are going to go to the Democrats or to the liberals. Now, the projections we have, done by people who are neutral on this question, have indicated that anywhere that the elections for delegates at the Senate level will result in Democratic victories. They won't be overwhelming, but they will win more delegates. There isn't one analysis of those Senate districts now who have said that some of the Republicans are going to hold on. Even if they did by a few votes, the 15 votes at the statewide level are hardly going to give them control. I expect that this convention will be organized by Democrats, but they won't have overwhelming majorities. And that's a good thing, because it'll force people to sit down and work together to try and hammer out in compromise solutions that will meet our problems.
Mr. Lipsitz, I know, and I mentioned this a moment ago, part of your worry is about an erosion of rights that we currently have, right? Is there any evidence, and I've read some of Dr. Galey's work on this, but is there any evidence in the past of rights being taken away? Because it seems to suggest it's the other way around.
It's not from New York State, but you can't detach this. You can't detach this from national politics and national trends. The United States now has 29 right-to-work states, where essentially the labor movement is being wiped out. New York State is not one of them. Part of the reason for that is because we have a constitution that strongly enshrines the right to organize. And this is one of the fundamental issues that we are raising. And I don't believe in buying a pig in a poke, which is we have it, we don't want to lose it. Now that's the first point. The second point is there are ways to amend this Constitution, the Constitution. Jeremy pointed out that the number 2 ballot initiative actually takes away pensions from those who commit felonies and other crimes as part of their public service. That's an example of being able to amend, and even though Sheldon Silver is a multimillionaire, I understand that. Not every single person who gets convicted of such crimes is a multimillionaire, and many of them are doing this stuff precisely to boost up their own pensions. So this will cut back. There's no question in my mind. This will cut back in a substantial and fundamental way on that type of corruption. I'm in favor of that method. I'm not in favor of opening up what essentially could be a Pandora's box. Now, people say, when I've heard this, people have criticized this for being afraid of democracy. I'm not afraid of democracy. Our organization is a very democratic organization. I'm elected. I'm elected by the members of the organization that employ me, in fact. We're not afraid of democracy. What we're afraid of is opening up something that shouldn't be opened and not utilizing the methods that already exist in order to expand rights. I'm with what Dr. Galey said. I'd like to see expansion of rights in the area of environment, and I think it was clean air and clean water, I think is actually what they were talking about. I'd like to see that. Let's do it. But we don't have to have a constitutional convention to do so. That's my point.
That actually flows well into one of the questions that we got from the audience. Are delegates sequestered in any way to keep lobbyists away from them? And is there any way to reduce bribery or coercion of delegates? Because I think that's one of the concerns that you bring up, right? How do you maybe protect the integrity of this? Dr. Galey or Mr. Bose?
Well, there are lobbyists in the sense that any citizen can contact one of those delegates and talk to them. They must register. There are limits on what they can do, but like any organization, people are capable of trying to persuade them to do certain things. That certainly will happen. That's I'm not particularly concerned about that. I do notice we haven't had much corruption in these delegates. But would you repeat that question and his answer because I
the second part, is there any way to reduce bribery or coercion of delegates?
Well, I don't think there is that many, but let me say this about the convention. I think we have an exciting possibility for the first time, maybe in the history of the world, that's said without exaggeration. This may be the first constitutional convention that will be held in an era of the internet. Now, do you know what that means? That means, for one thing, just saving money. It means that a whole lot of stuff that we had to print, reams and reams of this stuff, will now be available instantaneously to delegates. But more than that, we will have simulcast. We will have a convention as open as any in the history of the world. The access, the interaction between citizen and delegate will be far greater This convention will be the most open and most diverse in the history of the United States.
Do you understand then why labor unions, even if just on that sole single issue, would be opposed to this?
I certainly understand the position they're taking if I don't agree with it, but I can tell you this. You know, it's one of those things where I hear this all the time. Well, anything is possible. Isn't that a great phrase? Anything is possible. You know, and I guess we could say, you know, I could win the lottery on Saturday. It's possible, sure. But am I going to go in and quit my job tomorrow on the if come that it will? No, because I'm going to gauge how likely that possibility is. What do I have to base that possibility on? And then I have to base it on what am I probably got on the other side. So, you know, certainly could a convention conceivably go in and all of a sudden make New York a right-to-work state? Sure, that's possible, like me winning the lottery is possible. But let me tell you why I don't think they will. Is that, number one, there's no movement right now to turn New York into a right-to-work state, even among the existing Republicans in the state. You have a situation where you have anything they would do would have to go to the voters for approval. And in a state like New York, there is no support at that level to turn New York into a right-to-work state. You know, so the chance of that happening is, in my mind, infinitesimal. I mean, when you look, we have the highest union rate percentage-wise in the country. We have the most number of public employees in the country. Everybody knows people who are, I counted the other day, you know how many close friends and family members I have that are members that are public employees? 22. And I don't want to see any of them lose any rights that they've gained. So you have such a strength in the existing labor situation that we have that there's no push or impetus or in my mind conceivable path how New York could turn into a right-to-work state. But I also know there are a lot of things that I know for sure are not going to get done if we don't have a convention, and those are the things I discussed earlier.
Mr. Lipsitz, isn't it infinitesimal the chance that
that's hyperbole. The chance of hitting a lottery, not the little one, not the 3-digit one where you box it and you hit it straight, okay, that one you can hit. The big one. The chances of that happening to an individual are about the same as being hit by lightning twice in your lifetime. That's the actual fact. The chance of New York going right to work is considerably less than that. There are people in this state who would do it like that. There are people in the Greater Buffalo Partnership who would do it like that. And there are politicians in significant sections of the state who talk about it all the time. We're against right to work. We think it will weaken the living standard, not just of the men and women that you know who are public sector. This is for the private sector as well. The private sector in New York State is strong in the union side. And as a result, we have lots of people who have middle class and working class occupations that actually earn a decent living. Over our considerable opposition, will that ever change? We are interested in expanding that. And we're interested in not opening a Pandora's box. Now we have to fight off this right to work possibility. We have too many other things that we should be doing as a labor movement for us to be spending our time trying to stop something that right now, I agree with him, right now is a long shot in New York State. You open a convention, it's no longer a long shot. I would also agree it's probably not likely, but it's not impossible. And it's certainly the chances of it happening are certainly not like winning the big lottery.
Mr. Toth, if I can kind of follow up on that, part of the process is once the Constitutional Convention would come up with amendments that they would go before the voters. Isn't that your fail-safe at the end of the day?
No. And in 1967, when they did this, they made an enormous historic mistake. And there's nothing to prevent them from making the same mistake. That mistake is the convention decided to put it to the voters as one single vote. Yes or no? They could have broken it into different articles, different amendments. They could have separated out the controversial items from the straightforward items. But in what I think people recognize as sort of a political game that the Speaker of the Assembly at the time was playing, who, by the way, was also president of the convention, he, in an attempt to force through an amendment that was controversial, he put it all together. And so it was one yes or no vote. So, for those of us on this side worried about the Pandora's box, what will be snuck into a 1 or 2 or 3 vote process? So yes, we will get to vote for it, but it's a question of how it's presented, and will there be poison pills, or will there be positive things? And all of that is up in the air. There's no way to answer it. We can assume they won't make the same mistake again, but it's just an assumption.
Can we do, if you'll indulge me for a second, a lightning round real fast? Because we have a lot of these questions that are really like kind of quick.
Okay.
And so anybody just kind of jump in. The first one I could actually answer because I've covered it so much. You mentioned 3 men in a room. That means, can someone explain that?
Oh,
Or I could, but no, please.
I mean, that's the governor, the assembly speaker, right now is Carl Hastie, and the Senate Majority Leader right now is John Flanagan. Some people say 4 men in a room because there's an independent Democratic caucus, which is run by Jeffrey Klein. But, and basically those 3 individuals, or 4, are the ones that make all the decisions in the state. And then they go back to their caucus and say, this is what you need to vote for. And then the caucus votes for it. So anything that's done in the state, whether it be the budget, whether it be significant legislation, is basically done behind closed doors by these 3 or 4 individuals.
And if I could just add, the reason for that, and we have, I think, the most dysfunctional legislature in the Union, the reason for that dysfunction in 3 men in a room is because of the rules of the Assembly and the Senate. The rules of those 2 houses put all of the power in the Speaker, all of the power in the Majority Leader. So they make committee assignments, and they decide what are called Lulus, and they decide staff salaries, and they decide what your office looks like. It is the rules of the legislature that create 3 men in a room. Why is that important? Because the convention, if we have a convention, will determine its own rules. In 1967, the convention adopted the rules of the Assembly. Why? Because the president of the convention was the Speaker of the Assembly. So he was able to keep a grip on that convention process by making all the committee assignments, all of which were majority Democrat, because he was a Democrat. All the staff hiring, you know, he gave the minorities some money, but the staff hiring was largely his, because they mirrored the process, the dysfunction that we had in the legislature.
Of course, Travia did not have anywhere near the kind of control over that convention that he wanted to have, because they're not legislators in there. They were independent judges, they were past legislators, they were local governments, those kinds of people. They're not amenable to the Speaker, Travia. They might have been if they were legislators, but not then. But I need to say something about this right to work thing. They've admitted to us that it's not a likely possibility now. That's important because there's no evidence that it is. But I just received a poll from Brew College. It's New York State Constitutional Convention poll for release today. And it asked voters if they wanted a convention, what are the kind of things they would be for? Mandate air and water quality? Term limits for statewide office? Convention ethical questions about legislation decided by an independent body? We go all the way down here until we get to 2 interesting questions. A convention could recommend eliminating the right to collective bargaining. That's on the bottom. 80% would have anything to do with it. I want to reemphasize to the importance of this powerful commitment among New Yorkers. Are we going to somehow turn New Yorkers into marionettes? The 1.5 million to 2 million labor union members who vote are going to, on Proposition Day, oh, geez, amendment to take away our rights. Want to vote for that? Now this question, Jeremy actually would have given the answer I gave about the poison pill. The big mistake they made in 1967 was precisely to put in there something that the voters didn't like, and so they voted it down. If they do that again, I'd really be surprised, because this year they'll take the controversial issues, put them as separate amendments for voters to decide, because nobody wants to work for 6 to 8 months and see it all go down in flames. They'll put all of the non-controversial propositions in one package and then give voters a chance to pick and choose. They're much more likely to succeed if they do that, and they will do that the way they did it in 1938. These are important points you need to take away.
Someone has a great question. Can anyone explain whether rights in the Constitution are replicated in statute? And I imagine it depends on the right that we're talking about.
These guys can answer that.
We don't have a lawyer on the panel.
There are some, well, I've done some work on this. There are some criminal procedure rights, for example, which are replicated. There's, in fact, criminal procedure rights in the statutes that go beyond what's in the Constitution. There's no right to bear arms in the New York State Constitution, but curiously, and not many people know this, there is a right to bear arms in the statutes of New York. So, by and large, you have a combination of statutory and constitutional rights. In fact, you have 3 of them in the United States. The ones at the national level, the ones at the state constitutional level, and the ones at the statutory level. I don't know whether that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's great.
It does. It elects, the body selects by majority rule the leadership, and then individuals will, if they do what they did in '68, will request positions on committees they're interested in. It's pretty much standard. It will not be by seniority, though. So you will have a committee structure that doesn't look very much different than the one in '67, because the issues of the Constitution pretty much determine, the articles of the Constitution. And these committees will then set to work. Individuals will have proposals they want debated, they want to bring them to the floor, the committee will work out. A lot of them, there are a lot of things that are entered into these committees that never see the light of day and shouldn't. Eventually a committee will move to the floor with a motion to adopt something. There will be debate on that. What happens initially is, boy, does that need more work, or forget it, go back to the committee, or we're not going to entertain that. That process continues until the majority on the floor adopts or gets a majority for the propositions. That's how the process would work.
Mr. Toast and Mr. Lipsitz, you might like this question. I don't know if it's true or not, but it says, why are the Koch brothers said to favor the convention, and is that cause for concern? I guess that brings up big moneyed interest and worry about influence that could have on the process.
Back when this year began, I had heard rumors that the Koch brothers were coming to town to spend lots of money. I personally have not seen that money, so I don't know if it's true. I don't know what motivates people like the Koch brothers to spend their money on anything. If we have a convention, will they fund campaigns for delegates? I have no idea. Personally, I've seen no evidence of any particular big money, shadowy money, leading up to the election in 2 weeks. And I was worried about it. I genuinely was. But at this point, I've seen really nothing other than, the signs that we're all seeing.
I think Jeremy's right. That was reported to us, and we've been concerned about that corrosive variety of politics spreading to a campaign around the Constitutional Convention. But I would also say about the Koch brothers, what I do know about them is they spend their money fairly wisely. And if they don't think that this is going to go through, they're not going to spend it to waste it. And if it does go through, my prediction is you will see them get active in this and support people for the Constitutional Convention. It's one of the reasons why I say you open up this possibility. Anything could happen.
Mr. Rhodes, do you have a worry that big moneyed interest could come in and influence the process?
Well, I think to speak to what my two colleagues said, and I appreciate the honesty, to speak to what my two colleagues said, and I appreciate the honesty about not having big money in the process. I have looked at the financial disclosures so far, and I can tell you the money that's come in has predominantly been from the unions. There's been about $1,300,000, $1,400,000 that's poured into the No campaign, largely funded by unions. The Yes campaign has been largely funded by small donor individuals, putting in $250 here and there. And I think there was a newspaper article that just came out in Politico, and I think the Buffalo News even in the last 2 weeks had an article about how the money that's come in has really favored the No. Again, I think to speak to the issue, I think that you won't see a big influx of that outside money because I think the Koch brothers aren't going to think that they can do anything in New York anyway. I mean, in the end, everything still has to go back to the voters. And I don't believe that you can take a blue state that's as blue as New York and turn it red. Maybe you can take a purple state and turn it red, but you're not going to turn New York into Kansas.
People of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Pennsylvania might disagree with you.
Well, and they also voted for Donald Trump. We didn't do that. We didn't fall into that trap.
No, we didn't. But we're going to get into the whole what propaganda was aimed at what sections of the population and who paid for that and who collaborated with it. And I think that those things take place in the real world. And I think the people who took over our government absolutely participate in that kind of thing. And I don't think that that couldn't happen in New York in the future. I'm being blunt about that. That's separate from whether or not Constitutional Convention will be subject to the same type of political pressures. I don't know. I can tell you that I don't want to find out. And the best way to do that is to stick with the Constitution as we have it and use the amendment process that exists currently and work like hell to elect honest people who will actually do the work of what's in the interest of ordinary people. And that's the challenge. And it's a very big challenge. It's not something that I can do by snapping my fingers. It's not something you can do by snapping your fingers and being part of a program to have a constitutional convention. The problem still will exist. And as I came here tonight because I felt like it was important to have this discussion, and I'm glad we did. But our position is very clear. We are concerned about the taking away of rights that are now sacrosanct in the Constitution, and we want to use the current amendment process to go ahead and see things change. That's it.
Just a comment on that. If you listen to the argument carefully, it's not an argument against holding a convention in 2017. The implications are holding a convention at all. In 1997, I have the literature. You'd be amazed if the literature opposing the convention for the public sector union is almost word for word the same argument in 97. There's a danger. Now, there's a danger in 2017. Will there be a danger in 2037? I mean, everybody thinks at some point there's a danger. If we think that way, we eat at the vitals of the democracy.
I just want to say one thing. It's not just the public sector unions that are against the
Well,
Constitution.
whoever it is.
No, please. We have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and actually close to 1 million workers who are in the private sector, who are very concerned for similar kinds of reasons. They don't get their pension through the New York State Constitution. They get their pension through negotiating with employers to provide them for some retirement relief so they can have a retirement. The right to work, which we are concerned about, opens the door to that being taken away because they won't have the same kind of collective bargaining rights that they have right now. In our Constitution right now, those collective bargaining rights are sacrosanct. And I don't, and speaking for my organization, we're not interested in seeing that go out. And you may be right, I didn't look back to 97. I'm sure you're right. You're obviously a very learned man on these questions. And I appreciate being on a panel with you. But the fact of the matter is that the same concerns could exist in 37. That's right. And they could exist in 57. Because we are constantly fighting just to keep what we have in this country. And that's why we've come out so strong against this.
So in my opening statement, I was not here to convince anybody of anything. And what I found is particular people have a particular issue that they're passionate about or that they represent members on. And because of that issue, they take a particular stand on this issue. Or you've heard term limits 3 or 4 times. There's something that somebody really wants to see in the Constitution that's not there now. And so that's motivating, that's driving them. And all of that makes sense to me. I mean, that's all perfectly reasonable. What you have to answer for yourself is what are the issues that you care about? What is the one thing you want? What is the one thing you're afraid of losing, or one thing that could be put in the Constitution that you're afraid of? And you have to make the calculation for yourself because, again, nobody can predict with any certainty exactly how this is going to turn out. And if you're comfortable with that, and I was in 97, I'm not now. In 97 I voted yes. I'm not voting yes because I'm just not comfortable with that uncertainty.